So all cameras basically work the same. Then this is where I wanted to sort of start today, is the overview of a camera. So this is a Nikon D3200. And as you can see, I also have here in front of me, I have this Nikon D3000. I also have, well, here is the Nikon D3200. I actually have one of those. Here's a Nikon D70. And here is a Nikon D7100. Now, again, these are all digital cameras to start with. So they all are similar, but there's differences to them. And I'm going to try to show you some of the differences as I go through this today. Now, I'm not going to talk about every part of the camera. This is an intro to photography class, but what I wanted to do was give you this type of overview so that you could see where the buttons are. If you're trying to do something, you know, quite often, I don't know how to use the camera for everything. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but I'll know that I want to do something. If I'm going on a shoot and I know that I want to shoot HDR, or that I'm going to have problematic things. And if you don't even know what I'm talking about, that's fine. We'll get to that later. And a lot of times I just Google things. How do I do this? And there is so much information online. There is so much available to you. I see my job not as giving you all the information, but helping you understand how to find the things that you want to find, how to make sense of them, and just how things are working so that you can better understand how a camera functions and what its capabilities are. And, you know, again, we aren't going to go through everything in this class, but as you start using the camera, you will start to see more and more things that you might want to do, or how you might want to use it, or how you don't want to, how that technical side of photo doesn't appeal to you. And that's fine too. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. But here on the Nikon D3200, let me grab my Nikon D3200. Oh, it's not this one here. So as you can see, this is a Nikon D3200. We're looking at it from the top here, and there just are all these things. What I'm going to talk about here is this, basically this exposure dial in a minute. But what I'd like you to notice is the on-off switch. So a digital camera is going to require a battery. Make sure that you have the battery in your camera. Make sure it's charged and ready to go. You also want to make sure before you go that you have an SD card in the camera, okay? If it's a new one, it may have to be formatted. If you need to format your camera, then you're going to have to go back here. Oh, my camera just went dead on me. Let me see if I have another battery here that I can use on this one. I think these two cameras use the same battery. So here I am telling you that you need to make sure your camera's, nope, not going to work on this one. Okay. All right, I'll have to charge that one in a couple of minutes.
Professor, I have a quick question.
Sure.
So I have a Kodak Pix Pro, I think it's AZ421. Would that work for this class, or would I need a different camera?
Do you have it in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Can you turn your camera on and show it to me?
Yeah, hold on. Hold on. Okay. Oh, you can't even see. Hold on.
All your light's coming from the back side here.
One
yeah,
side.
I can't really see it. Okay. You know what?
There we go.
That's okay. As soon as I finish my lecture today, I'll Google it, and I sound so old when I say I'll Google it. I'll look it up online and see what it says about it, and I'll let you know.
Okay, yeah, because it doesn't have Like I can't attach different lenses or anything like that. Like it's a straight.
Yeah, my guess is we'll talk about those cameras here in a second. My guess is it's not a DSLR. So we'll talk about what it can do and what it can't do, but I'll take a look at it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. So now, again, make sure your battery's charged. Here in your camera, make sure that you have a SD card. If it's not formatted, you may have to use the menu button on the back of your camera. Now we're going to talk about this menu back here. So just hold off and I'll show you, but you're going to have to go into the menu and possibly there'll be a part that says format memory card, and you'll have to use this little dial to get to that. It's hard to do it without looking at it. Okay, got to come over here, go up. It'll say format memory card. You'll hit the OK. It'll ask you, are you sure? Because you're going to lose everything. You just go ahead and hit yes. And it will format your memory card for you. So if it's saying that there's no memory card or that it needs formatting, that's how you would go about doing that. But basically that little SD card operates as the film in your digital camera. So let me go back to sharing my screen with you here. All right, and we'll take a look at, again, we're going to take a look at the exposure dial here in a few minutes, but you know, all those other things that are on this camera, there's just so many things. There's a microphone on it. There's, because you can shoot video with these cameras as well. We're not going to talk about that at all in this class. We'll be talking about the hot shoe up here and the built-in flash. Then some of the buttons on here, exposure compensation, one that I'll be talking about when I look at this camera will be this little plus minus sign. When we get to that, I'll talk about what's going on in there. There's a self timer. There's all sorts of things happening in there. But this should give you a little bit of an overview, a breakdown of the things, a sentence or two on what they are and what they do. Again, looking from the top, things to pay attention to. The shutter release button we'll be talking about. The on-off switch we will be. The command dial, depending on what kind of camera you have. This camera here has a single dial on it. This one here that's considered a more professional type of camera has a dial on the back. It also has a dial on the front. And that's because it controls two different things. Using my stuff here. This camera doesn't have a lens on it right now, but this one, again, will have a dial in the back and a dial in the front. So depending on what kind of camera you have, how many dials you have, where things are, as you can see on this one only has an MASP. Some of the mode dials will have many more things on it, and we're going to talk about those in a few minutes. So all things to pay attention to on your camera. And again, a little overview here, the side of the camera. Again, we'll look at some of these things. The zoom ring and the focusing ring, very important to pay attention to those two things. We'll talk about what the difference is. The lens release button is here. We'll talk about the drive mode. If you want to use the self timer, this is also the button you would press to use a self timer, but you have to set that up in the menu. So between the camera, there's a lot of things it can do. And it's going to seem a little overwhelming at first, like, oh, there's just so many things. But I have to tell you, it's like learning to drive a car. There just seems to be so many things that you have to pay attention to. And then once you start using it, you just start doing the same things over and over again. And, you know, that's kind of what happens with a camera. I used to tell people it's like learning to drive a stick shift, but people don't drive manual transmissions anymore. But in the old days, you know, I learned to drive a manual transmission, which means that not only did I have to push in the clutch, push, the gear into whichever gear, slowly release the clutch as you gave it gas. You had to figure all those things out. You had to use both feet and your hand and work it all together to make the car go. Then automatic transmissions came and you just stepped on the gas or stepped on the brake, and it made driving a lot easier for people. But some people still like to drive manual transmissions, people who really like to use a car, people who race their cars, things like that, because it allows you to do things that just turning the automatic transmission over doesn't allow you to do. So same thing with the camera. For some of you, using your camera in the program modes or the auto modes is all you're going to want to do. For others of you, you're going to want to exert some creative control over your camera. So that's what we're going through here, is what does the camera allow you to do? So again, there's more things here in the back of the camera. The ones to pay attention to, we'll be looking at the selector dial and the OK button. The image playback button is always this one with the arrow on it. The menu button you'll need to find on your camera. Which camera is this? I forget. But most of the time, the menu button will be here along the side of the viewing screen. So, while technically the cameras all work alike, there's going to be different places for the buttons and, how to get to things. Conceptually, they'll all work the same. All right, now where is the camera mode dial and why is the camera mode dial important? Well, so I've told you all about how apertures and shutters work. I've given you the technical breakdown of how they work together, how you need to have the right amount of light hitting the film for the right length of time, or the sensor, I should say, how the ISO works, all of that. So you should understand that at least somewhat, 80% you understand. Great. Now, how do we use those things with our camera? Where do we start? What do we do? All right, so I've already talked about getting the battery charged, getting an SD card into your camera, getting that formatted, and now you're ready to go out and use your camera. So you're going to want to turn it on, and then you're going to want to set the camera. Now, what is the camera mode dial? So this one actually, here's what it looks like on a Canon, and here's what it looks like. Well, they have two Canons. Here's a non-professional Canon, and then this, or a Nikon. This is the more professional top of a Nikon camera, which looks more like this one here. And you can see the camera mode dial. This one just says mode. This one not only has the M, A, S, and P, which the M stands for manual, the S M stands for manual, P stands for program. The A and the S, one means aperture priority and the other one means shutter priority. I'm going to talk about those two things in just a second. If you're using a Canon, it'll say TV for shutter priority and AV for aperture priority. These are the four main camera modes for you to shoot in. Is one necessarily better than the other? No. With manual mode, what you're going to have to do is set the aperture, set the shutter, and use the light meter like I showed you in that lecture the other day. And to get to the light meter, often when your camera's on and you look through here and you press the button down halfway, you'll hear it beep. And then you'll see a shutter speed, you'll see an aperture, and you'll see that little light meter that I told you about, the little line that moves back and forth as you increase or decrease the aperture. Now, or the shutter. On my camera, when I press that button down halfway, you'll also see that it starts to read here. Now, as I move this dial, it's changing the shutter speed, and you can see it has 1/50, 80. So I go up 125. So it's showing me the shutter, and that's changing. Now, on a more expensive camera, you might have another dial here in the front. So, this camera, you know, the two more expensive cameras I have two dials. One does the shutter and the front one will do the aperture. If you don't have a front dial, what you need to look for is on your camera will be this one right here, the plus minus. Now, as you hold that down, so I'm going to press that down, and now I'm going to move this dial here. So without pressing it down, I'm changing the shutter speeds. When I press that plus minus down, so again, shutter speeds, press that down, and now I'm changing the apertures. And the apertures will always have an F in front of them. So that F9 is a size of an aperture. Where it's weird is when you, well, so just so you know, shutter speeds will always have a 1 over them. Apertures will always have an F. Those are called f-stops. The others are just called stops when you change the shutter. So now, those are how you change your aperture and your shutter in manual mode, okay? You'd have to use the light meter to find a correct exposure. The P setting, so again, if we look at the dial here, the P setting is program. And basically what program does is you turn the camera over. You just say, go ahead and give me a correct exposure. And usually what the camera will do is look for a moderate shutter speed, usually 60th of a second or faster, and then a moderate aperture, okay? And it will give you a decent exposure, all right? But basically you've turned your camera into a point and shoot camera. You've said, I don't care, I don't wanna think about depth of field, I don't wanna think about my ability to stop motion, I just want what you think is a correct exposure. And the camera will do that for you. Now, it's like turning your camera into one of these. This is a point and shoot camera. This does not allow you to change the aperture or shutter. It will photograph this. Actually, I use this one when I go underwater diving or things like that. It's quick, it's simple, and it doesn't require a lot of work, okay? But now, the reason why we have these other cameras, the reason why we have all this is because sometimes you want to do things differently. You want to think about your depth of field or your ability to stop motion. What the camera has done with aperture priority and shutter priority is made that a little bit easier for you. So instead of having to work in manual mode, if you know that you're at a soccer game and people are going to be running in front of you and you want to stop that action of those people running, 60th of a second is probably still going to blur. So you're going to want to shoot 2/50th, maybe 500th of a second. All right. What you can do is you set your dial on your camera to S. And now what you do is you dial in the shutter speed you want to use. Now, in this case, it's telling me I don't have enough light in here. That's why it's saying low. I don't have enough light to use 1/25th of a second in this room pointed at me. It's because I don't have a big enough aperture. My camera, the lens is not big, will not allow enough light to use that shutter speed, okay? So when something like that happens, you have a couple of options. The first is that you change the ISO. So remember those three things work together. So you increase the ISO. Now you are going to give up quality of your image, chance of getting a little bit more noise or things like that, which, you know, the new cameras they still hold together pretty well as you increase the ISO. But if you're thinking that this is going to be a big print on your wall or something, then you may want to not think about that. If it's just going to be a small image that you use for online or even maybe a small print, changing the ISO is not going to affect it that badly. But it will allow you to use a faster shutter speed, okay? The other thing is you just decide, okay, I can't shoot at 2/50th of a second. I can only shoot at 1/25th of a second, and you deal with the consequences of that. Third thing, and this is kind of ridiculous, is you go out and buy a really expensive lens. You know, this is this is a very big Nikon lens that is expensive and is used to shoot sports. One, it's long. We'll talk about the focal length, but it also has, a pretty big aperture and its ability to allow more light in it and things like that. So, but again, that's an expensive way to go. So usually it's about either changing your ISO or just deciding that shutter speed you're going to have to live with whatever it is. All right. So that is what shutter priority allows you to do. Aperture priority, very similar. You want everything from near to far in focus. You know that you're out shooting a landscape of some kind. There's a mountain and a stream that you're trying to photograph. You can set the aperture to f11 or f16, a small, very small aperture, which is going to give you a greater depth of field. Now, when you set that aperture, so again, we take the dial, turn it to A, and now when you press this down, you don't have to, I don't think you do, let me see here. So when you set it to aperture priority, you don't have to press the plus minus button. Just as you press this, as you change the f-stop, see how the f-stop is changing as I go here? And see what it's telling me over here? Now it's gone over a full second. For f11, I'd need 1.6 seconds exposure. Great, it will give me an exposure. But that 1.6 seconds, 1,001, 1,000, during that time, if I'm holding the camera, it's going to blur. If I'm photographing something other than mountains and trees and things like that, even trees, if it's windy, 1 second can blur them. But if you know that you're photographing something like that, then you're going to use a long exposure. You have to use a tripod or set your camera on something that's not going to move. You can set it on a rock, a table, something like that. But on the bottom, remember, there is this mount in case you want to use a tripod. So again, this is what the camera is allowing you to do, to make these choices. They are creative choices. You should know what it is that you're trying to get from your image. So those are the four main modes. And as you can see here, this is a slightly more expensive camera. It only has MASP. It doesn't have these little icons. It also has some other things there, but I'm not going to talk about those today. Those are for doing different things. This camera here, let me turn it on. As you look at the top of it, only has a mode button. Oh, I'm sorry. It doesn't even have it on the dial. A lot of them will have it over here. This one has it here, this button right here that says mode. And as I move this, it's showing me MAS or P. And then I can dial in my aperture or my shutter or however I want to go ahead and do it. So depending on what kind of camera you have, finding your way to the different modes is going to be important. Now, this is a brief breakdown of what I just talked about. The basic modes, these are, if you want to use these, this is fine. I prefer you try to just use the manual program, aperture or shutter priority modes. But if you want to, auto mode. So again, on this camera here, this dial that says auto in green is like doing a point and shoot camera. But when I set my camera to auto, it'll often pop up the flash here because it's usually there's not enough light. It'll often pop up the flash. I don't really want you to use the flash right now. So try to avoid using the flash. First of all these cameras have a flash on them. They're not the greatest. It's why they also have this thing here, this hot shoe. That's for a secondary flash. The flash that comes with your camera will give some light. It will make it okay. We'll talk about the different look that it will give to your images. So try to avoid using the flash right now until we get into the lighting segment of stuff. But let's go through the other things. So again, on this dial up here, you are going to have this little running man. What do you think the little running man does?
Faster speed or
It's
faster shutter speed?
It's called sports mode, and it's going to give you a faster shutter speed because you're telling it, oh, I'm going to be shooting things that are active. You know, that's what the running guy does. The little silhouette here, portrait mode. What portrait mode does is, remember, depth of field is everything from near to far in focus. It's great when you're working on a landscape or something like that. But if you're doing a portrait and all the leaves in front of the person are in focus and the tree and the mountains and everything behind them are in focus, our eye kind of will skim over everything. If the foreground and the background are out of focus, then you go to the area that's in focus. So portrait mode gives you sort of a moderate depth of field. It usually shoots around f5.6 or f8 so that the foreground and the background will be slightly blurry. What I found so interesting, the Super Bowl game, other than some of the commercials and the halftime show was horrible, but the camera that they were using, they usually don't use a shallow depth of field camera, but for a lot of the interviews and close-ups on the players, they were using a very shallow depth of field, a camera that was blurring the foreground and the background, so you were just seeing the player. And my son was on, he's like, God, I really like that camera. I usually don't like, and it's because, first of all, there was nobody in the stands. So I guess they were trying to not show that as much. So they used a more shallow depth of field, and it just made the images more interesting. So same thing with this portrait mode. It's going to give you that shallower, a moderately shallow depth of field. If any of you have an iPhone, they went with a portrait mode. That's to give you a shallow depth of field. It mimics a large aperture. So that's what that mode does there. I'm going to skip this one here for a minute. This one here with the mountains, landscape mode. What do you think that's going to do? Greater depth of field. It's going to shoot with a smaller aperture, or as small as it can do, to give you the greatest depth of field. These other two, and they're called, so if you go down here, night portrait mode, it tells you what that's going to do. I never really rely on it. If you want to try it out, that's great. And then the little flower is close-up mode, or some people will call it macro mode. It doesn't turn your lens into a macro lens, so you don't get that. But what you're trying to do is to get as close to your subject as possible. So it changes the way it focuses a little bit, and it usually just slightly overexposes your images. So those are the modes on that dial. Again, do you have to use all of them? Do you have to use any one? No, they're there to help you get your camera to do what it is that you're trying to do. So right now I'm giving you a lot of technical information, okay? This is all straight up technical stuff, how a camera works. I have to tell you, I don't truly believe in straight up technical stuff. My approach to photography is that the ideas and the final image are the most important thing. How you get there is up to you. But just because you have the newest, the latest, just because you know all the technical stuff, doesn't mean you're going to make good images. Somebody can have all the money in the world and still not lead an interesting life. It's what you do with the things you have. So sometimes I think people and actually artists are more inspired by their limitations, by trying to get someplace and having to work to get there, of trying to figure it out, of different ways of doing it. Because you may have an idea in your head and it just may not be possible. You're not always going to get the right amount of light. You're not always going to be able to get the depth of field or the exposure maybe that you want. You know, and you have to make do, and especially with an art form that's reliant on this little machine here, this little sort of technical instrument, it can be difficult sometimes. You know, I just had a couple of cameras donated. That's why I have so many here sitting here in front of me. But like this camera here, it's a great camera, a Nikon D70. It has all the stuff. It works great. It's an older camera. The first thing you'll notice if you have a camera like this is it uses this, which is not an SD card. This is a compact flash card. This was the old way. This was, you know, this was a cassette before CDs came into being. So SD cards are sort of the new thing. But this camera, they still sell compact flash cards. You can still get them. I think like I said, these cameras are being donated, so I'm not sure when we'll have them out and available to be checked out. But if you get one of these, that's what is in this camera, is a compact flash card. Now, all the other stuff works exactly the same. You know, the difference is the images are smaller file size. There's not as much information, and we'll talk about that when we get to file size. But if you can only get a camera like this, great, use it. An older, not as good camera is better than no camera. And I still think you can still make great images with an older camera like this. It shouldn't make that much difference. I'm gonna spend a little bit more time talking about that here in a few minutes. This should be a little reminder of exposure and what you're trying to do. Right amount of light for the right length of time. That's why I've made it bold. That's what it is. You will need to use the light meter. Again, your camera should have a light meter. Make sure you pay attention to it. Make sure you get your settings. I will also tell you though, that when you use your camera, there'll be a range of what are considered acceptable exposures. They'll be from underexposed, what the camera says is correctly exposed, to overexposed, and they will have a different feel to them. This is where it starts to become sort of a creative endeavor. You know, a lot of times if you underexpose an image, you know, enough that you see the image, but it goes sort of dark, it feels a little moodier. It's a little, you know, darker, as the name implies. And we'll start talking about that. If you were to take that same image and overexpose it, it would be brighter. A lot of times that seems happier, more outdoors. It seems a little hotter, you know. So again, how you choose to expose your images is going to be up to you, whether you like them darker, lighter. Again, some of this will be creative choice on your part. There'll be a range of acceptable, but how you choose to use those things is going to be up to you. I just reminded myself about something in there and now I forgot about it again. Okay, so again, when you're out with your cameras, now the great thing about a digital camera is you will see your images immediately. It's not like in the old days where you expose things and then you waited to get your film back to see what they look like. But even, and what photographers used to do back then, and still your camera has this ability to do, is what's called bracketing. You find what the correct exposure is, and maybe you shoot 1 or 2 stops underexposed and 1 or 2 stops overexposed. And you get a range. So maybe you go 1 stop over, on, and then 1 stop under. That would be a bracketing of 3. Maybe you go 2 stops under, 1 stop under, what considered normal, 1 over, 2 over. That's a bracket of 5. And when you get those images back, you can choose which one you like better. Now, we will be using Photoshop, so you'll also have that ability to change them in that. So you want to get a decent exposure. You know, generally you don't want things too underexposed because you'll lose detail. If they're too overexposed, you're going to lose detail. So underexposed, you lose detail in the shadows. Overexposed, you're going to lose detail in the highlights. So that's why generally you want a well-exposed negative that will, or image, we'll turn them into negatives, that gives you detail in both. And so a lot of times people will bracket for those sorts of things. Depending on your lighting conditions, whether you're going to need to maybe bring in detail in some of the shadow areas or bring in detail in the highlight areas. But we'll go on with that as we move forward. So again, here's a little reminder of exposure, your aperture, your shutter, and your ISO and ASA. Now, again, if you don't know what the exposure triangle is, watch. Again, it's about the aperture and shutter, giving you the correct, and then ability of using your ISO to move that scale over. And again, on that lecture I did last week, I sort of spend a little bit more time on that, but it should help you. And then here's a little reminder of what ISO is and how it's going to affect your picture quality. Yeah, I hate these things, but they can be useful sometimes. So, where you might want to set your ISO under different lighting conditions. Most of your cameras now will have an auto ISO. It will change the ISO depending on what you're trying to shoot. So most of the time that will work fairly well, but there are times that you may want to change the ISO for your own reasons. Again, a little review about aperture and shutter and how they work together if you need to go over that. And now we'll talk about depth of field. Again, remember, that is the consequence of aperture choice. So as you can see, a large aperture, a more shallow depth of field, a smaller aperture, a greater depth of field. And so this sort of shows you on, if you were looking out on the plane, how that would work. A little reminder of it, here is a photo shot with a small aperture, so you can see everything from near to far in focus. A large aperture, as you start to get things out of focus, what is in focus is just the person there. So you can see where it falls off. All right, so a little bit more about apertures, distance from the lens, a little overview of it.